Hey, this is Jesse with Create This. I've had my solar generator in service for a couple of days now. In general, I'm really enjoying the way this LifePO4 battery is performing. However, when I've asked questions on the Solar Panel Talk forums about how much capacity I can expect from this battery when I'm charging up to 13.6 volts and I'm discharging down to 2.7 volts, 2.9 volts, somewhere around in there, I can't get a straight answer on how much capacity there actually is in the battery. Some people say 99%. When you charge up to 13.6 volts, you get 99% of the battery's capacity. Some people say 80%. I'm liable to think that it's more around the lines of like 92%. I thought we would do a little experiment and we would charge up the battery to the point where it stops charging at 13.6 volts. On the Victron power meter, we'll call that 100% because the Victron is set up to reset to 100% full at 13.6 volts, right? What I've also done is I've set the battery capacity here to 100 amp hours, okay? This is a 100 amp hour LifePO4 battery. So my rationale here is if my Victron power meter thinks that there are 100 amp hours available, if I'm getting less than 100 amp hours, it should tell me about it. So currently it's at 95.7% charged. Looks like we've used 4.6 amp hours. And at this rate, I'm not quite sure. We're currently putting in 3.7 amps, which is a little lower than the Midnight Classic's reported 4.1 amps because the Classic itself is drawing some of that amperage. We're putting in about 50 watts. It says it's charging 55. It's a cloudy day. I've still got those 4 solar panels out there. This'll take a little while to charge up to 100%. And when it does, we're gonna float it until it gets to 0 amps. That should be safe. There shouldn't be any problem with doing that. And then I've got this APO3, Automatic Power Off 3. And I've set this is basically a relay with Anderson connectors attached, right? And so I've set this thing to a 12.7 volt cutoff. So it'll disconnect the relay at 12.7 volts with 0 delay. So it'll see that voltage and it'll disconnect at 12.7 volts. So what I'll do is I'll use my little 300 watt inverter. I'll hook it up to the APO3. I'll hook the APO3 up to the battery and we will run our 2 incandescent light bulbs. I think I've got a 60 watt and I've got a 120 watt or something. Comes out to about 160 watts. I know the math doesn't add up. There's something wrong with one or both of those light bulbs. They're not drawing the full wattage. But anyway, I'll hook those up to the inverter. I'll run those constantly until the APO3 disconnects the voltage. And then we will check the Victron power meter here and we will see how many amp hours have been drained from the battery. You know, if it says 100 amp hours, then we know that we've pretty much charged it to 99% or, 100% because this is a 100 amp hour battery, right? That's the rated capacity. If it says 80 amp hours, then we'll know that we've charged it to 80% capacity. Or 90% capacity. We've drained it down to like 10% or whatever because 12.7 volts there's still a little bit of capacity there. The point is just to figure out exactly how many usable amp hours this battery has, right? Because I don't know at this point. All right, and one thing that I'd like to check as we do this or before we do this is I'd like to go into the main menu here and I'd like to go to charge. And I'd like to see if I can set my float voltage to 13.6. So it's currently EQ is 13.6, absorb is 13.6, and float is 13.5. So what I want to do is I want to set float to 13.6 if I can, but it won't let me. So this charge controller, if you've got absorb and EQ set to 13.6, float is always 13.5. It won't go up to 6. So that's fine. I just wanted to check that. All right, it's maybe an hour and a half later, something like that. Our voltage is up to 13.63 volts. It is saying that we are 100% charged, but we're still getting, an amp and a half, something like that, input. What we're gonna do is we're gonna let it completely peter out to 0 amps, and then we'll run our discharge test. It's later on in the day now. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're down to fluctuating between 0.3 and 0.9 amps, which is between, I don't know, 2 and like 10 watts, something like that. Our voltage is at 13.64, 13.65. It keeps oscillating, and we're waiting out the float cycle. My solar panels are about to enter shade at this point of the day, so probably what I'll do is I'll turn off the Midnight Classic for tonight, and then tomorrow we'll let it float some more. Okay, it's been a couple of days. This morning when I came out, it was charging at, I don't know, something as high as like 8 amps, I think, or no, I don't know, it was charging. Okay, so we just kicked into float, 4.1 amps, 4.2 amps. I'm not sure why it was resting. That doesn't make any sense. It's a little cloudy out here, but it's not cloudy enough that it wouldn't have available wattage. All right, we'll check back in a little bit. So this is interesting. The amperage is rapidly falling. We've got 31 watts going in, 2.5 amps. The voltage is 13.64 according to the Victron, and the amperage is still falling, 2.1 amps. Okay, we're at 0 watts. I think at this point, the float cycle is just, it's oscillating, right? Like, for a second, the charge controller will, because the charge controller draws like 5 watts by itself, right? So I think what happens is the wattage falls down to like below 5 watts, right? And then you start pulling energy out of the battery to maintain the charge controller. And so at that point, now suddenly you can put energy back into the battery, so the charge controller ramps up a little bit. You know, I think it's just oscillating. So I'm going to call it at this point. I'm going to call this battery full, because we're seeing 0 amps occasionally on the Victron meter here. I should be seeing at least 20 watts coming out of these solar panels in these cloud conditions. It's not that dark, right? So I'm going to call it, and we're going to turn off the Midnight Classic. So I'm going to pull the solar panel wires here. There we go. And I'm going to turn off the charge controller. We now have 0 amps coming out of the battery. The Victron pulls something, but it's in like the milliamp range, right? Our voltage is 13.62 volts with the Midnight Classic turned off. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're just going to put a load on it, but we're going to put a load through the LifePO4 automatic power off. We'll hook up the inverter and some light bulbs, and we will see how many amp hours this battery contains when it is 100% charged between 13.62 volts, which is what we're at right now, and 12.7 volts, which is what the cutoff is for the LifePO4. This is just a 45 watt or 45 amp to 75 amp adapter, and plug this into my inverter here. We'll just turn on the inverter, and we should see amperage being drawn now. Yep, 4 watts, all right. And let's put some loads on there. We'll put some light bulbs on the inverter. I gotta tell you, I haven't used a single incandescent bulb in my house in 6 years. It's 2016, I moved in 2010, and I haven't used one that whole time. The minute I moved in, I populated the house with CFLs. It's an old house, and it certainly had some incandescents available, but I immediately populated it with CFLs. And then years later, I populated it with LEDs. So this is like a blast from the past for me, man. It's crazy how much power they draw. And let's see, I'm just gonna clamp these to a shelving system that I have sitting around nearby. That way they don't burn anything. Kind of point them out into the open air. We're drawing 167 watts right now through the inverter, and we've drawn already negative 0.2 amp hours. We're going to more or less trust the LifePO4 to do its job properly and to cut the power when the working voltage comes down to 12.7 volts. This will protect the battery, and when the LifePO4 has decided that the battery is empty, we will check again the amp hours drawn, extracted from the battery through the negative shunt on the Victron energy power meter, and that'll tell us what our operating capacity is of this battery. So should be pretty interesting. We'll check back later. All right, it's about 2 hours later. We've got 13.18 volts on the battery. Still drawing 12.8 amps, 168 watts. And so far we've used up 28.3 amp hours. And we're, if you want to look at it from a 100 amp hour perspective, we're down to 70%. And we've got a 1.5 hour runtime, it looks like. That doesn't quite make sense. I'm not sure why that says 1.5 hours. Anyway, check back in probably about an hour and see how it's doing. All right, so my LVD, my APO4 automatic power off, shut off the load a couple of seconds ago, about 30 seconds ago. So I'm just waiting to see if it'll do it again. The battery voltage is hovering right at around 13 volts. Looks like we've got 48.3 amp hours out of this battery so far. It says we're at 49.2%, which is kind of meaningless, but it, you know, oh, there we go, and we're off again. Yeah, it keeps shutting off. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the inverter at this point. No point to continue cycling it. And I will unplug the APO4. It has done its job, and there you go. So, let's see, -2 watts, where's that coming from? Oh, unplug the APO4 for real. It's kind of funny that it still thinks that I'm drawing amperage from the battery. That's odd. I wonder why it thinks that. As far as I know, there's nothing else on except for the Victron power meter. -1 watt. 2 watts. Huh. Never seen it do that before. Weird. Shunt thinks that I'm still drawing 2 watts. It's very strange. I don't understand that. Anyway, 48.5 amp hours is our final capacity, between 13.6 volts charged and 12.7 volts discharged at a 178 watt discharge rate. We only get 48.5 amp hours. That's less than half the battery capacity. This is a 100 amp hour battery. So that's not so good. I think what we will do now is we will try charging up to 13.8 volts instead of 13.6 and see how much of a difference that makes. So I'm going to turn the charge controller back on. I'm going to plug it back into solar. And I'm going to go into the menu. I'm going to charge, volts. I'm going to raise this up to 13.8 volts. I'm going to raise the absorb voltage up to 13.8 volts. And I'm going to raise the float voltage up to 13.7. Write that to the charge controller. And we're pulling in 99 watts. So at this point, we'll let it charge back up and we'll run another discharge cycle at 13.8 volts and see how many amp hours of capacity we get out of that. All right, it is the following day, about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I just realized that I need to set my charge voltage on the Victron to 13.8 volts. That didn't work. Let's see. There we go. That worked. All right, and just to verify that we're at the correct charge voltage here. Yep, 13.8. Okay, so we're only bringing in 50 watts. It's kind of cloudy this morning, but we'll check back in when it's full. All right, so it is a little bit later in the day. I think it's like 1 o'clock or something. 250 watts going in. I saw it go up to 300 a couple of seconds ago. That was pretty cool. Never seen it go that high before. It looks like we've stored or written 0.4 kilowatt hours into the battery so far. Looking at the power meter, it says that it's 80.1%. It says that we've got about 20 amp hours left to replace. This is just kind of interesting for me because 0.4 kilowatts is 400 watts, right? So 400 watt hours. And if we look back at how many amp hours we extracted from the battery, it says that we extracted 48.5 amp hours yesterday. 48.5 times, call it 12.8 volts. That's like 620.8 watt hours, right? 620 watt hours. So if this battery is 100% efficient or 99% efficient, I should only see 0.6 kilowatt hours today before this battery is fully charged. Now granted, the Midnight Classic is going to be drawing some wattage from the battery. So 5 watts, call it like, I don't know, call it 24 hours, right? Because I turned it on yesterday. So 120 watts would have been extracted by the Midnight Classic in a 24-hour period. So if we add that to the amount of power, the amount of capacity that the battery has, so it's got 620 kilowatt or 620 watt hours plus 120, you know, we should see 740 watt hours. So this kilowatt hour reading here should say no more than 0.8 before the battery is completely charged, if it really has 99% efficiency. So that'll be interesting to see. Wow, 334 watts going in. I saw it go up to 336. That was cool. Only for a brief period of time, but man, 331, 333, that's awesome. It's only a 400 watt array, so that's pretty good efficiency. I see some cloud cover too. The time is now 2:17 p.m. Looks like we're only pulling in between 5 and 11 watts. Our amperage meter is going down to 0, staying there for a minute, then coming back up. Our solar panels are in full sunlight, so I'm going to call it. I'm going to say that this is probably a fully charged LifePO4 battery because the amperage is going down to 0, and at this point it's cycling. So I'm going to pull the solar, and I'm going to turn off the Yeti, or I'm going to turn off the Midnight Classic. Voltage is 13.82 volts. Resting, that'll come down a little bit, I believe. We're at 100% charge, 0 amp hours withdrawn, 0 watts withdrawn, 0 amps being withdrawn. So at this point, I'm going to hook up my LifePO4 power meter, or power LVD, low voltage disconnect. Connect that up to our power source. Connect the load end up to the inverter, and we're going to power on the inverter, which is attached to 2 incandescent light bulbs. They're together drawing 168 watts, and we're just going to let this run until the LVD trips. Okay, looks like we are at 12.99 volts resting, and my LifePO4 has shut off right there. It just shut off my load, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it. We're down to 13.08 volts resting. Yeah, so that was 12.99 under load probably. Looks like we've used almost perfectly 50 amp hours out of the battery. So 50 amp hours times 12.8 volts is 640 watt hours. I'm not sure if that's actually how that calculation works, but 12.8 volts is the nominal voltage of the system. It's still only 50% of our capacity though, of the whole battery, which kind of concerns me a little bit. All right, so this is the guts of the LifePO4 unit, and you can see this little chart here. So we were set with the dip switch, we were set to 12.7 volts as the cutoff. The LifePO4 battery vendor actually recommended an LVD with an 11.8 volt cutoff. So I'm going to switch this down to 11.8 volts and put everything back together, and we're going to see how much more capacity we can drain from the battery at 11.8 volts. Okay. The time is now 8:22 p.m. This thing's been running for over 6 hours, 6 hours and 10 minutes, something like that, on the discharge cycle. Everything's going really well. I was concerned that I wasn't getting my full capacity out of this, and we're down to almost 80 amp hours extracted from the battery. And the state of charge meter says that we're at 20%. That's like a little over 1,000 watt hours extracted from the battery, which is really right around the area that I want to be. I kind of went into this project hoping to have about 1,000 watt hours of capacity available. So that's really awesome. So I think what I'm going to do at this point is, instead of using my, like right now my LVD is set to 11.8 volts. I'm going to try raising that. There's a setting, at first we did 12.7 volts, and then we did 11.8. And 11.8 seems a little low. So 12.7 was too high. I was only getting about 50% of the capacity of the battery out with 12.8 or 12.7. So let's try the setting in between, 12.1, and let's see if it beeps and disconnects the LVD at that setting. So I'm going to disconnect the LVD from the charge controller. I'm going to remove the case. Okay, and let's see, 12.1 is switch 1 off, switch 2 on. So I'm just gonna pop switch 2 on. Okay, switch 2 is on. Put it back together. What I wanna know is if this voltage set point, 12.1 volts, is being hit yet. Because I think my state of charge meter is lying to me about the voltage under load. I think it's adjusting the voltage upward. So I'm curious if this 12.1 volt set point is correct or not. Normally I would just hook a multimeter up to something, but I actually don't have any available pins to attach the multimeter to. So we're gonna do it this way. So battery and load, turn on the inverter, and we'll see if that shuts off in like a couple of seconds. If it doesn't, then I'm gonna say this is probably the set point that I'm gonna leave it at for this load. Now, if I were running, you know, granted, I'm only running 200 watts, right? If I were running 1,000 watts through this system, which I don't even have an inverter hooked up that's capable of dealing with that kind of power, but if I were running 1,000 watts through this system, I might consider a higher low voltage disconnect set point, because I wouldn't want to do any damage to the system, and the faster you go, the more likely you are to damage it. So in this case, 200 watt draw is like, it's really small. It's like 0.2 C or something. So I feel pretty comfortable using this 12.1 volt set point. I could probably even use the 11.8, but I don't think that I need to remove that last bit of capacity. I think I'm pretty good where I am. All right, so I'll let this run for a little bit, and I'll come back when the inverter shuts off. All right, so it's 8:43 p.m. and it's getting dark. We're up to 80.1 amp hours extracted from the battery. We're down to, you know, the Victron meter for some reason says 16%. It can't add. Or maybe I can't add, I don't know. And then we're down to 12.82 volts according to the Victron power meter. So at this point, I think I'm just gonna call it good. You know, I really just wanted to be able to get 80% capacity out of this battery, and it's clear to me now that I can do that, no problem. So there may be another 10 amp hours between 12.8 volts and 11.8 volts. You know, there may be like another 5 amp hours between 12.8 and 12.1. I don't know. I don't know how much is down there. I don't really care. I don't want to damage my battery, you know, so I don't really have any need to drain it super, super low. You know, when I built this thing, I really wanted to get 80 amp hours out of it, and I got it. So I'm pretty happy. And I think that 12.1 volt LVD set point is absolutely fine for a 200 watt load. If I had a higher load, I think I would set my set point quite a bit higher than that at first, and just kind of see how that went. Although I don't know, because at this point I'm thinking I'm probably going to get a Victron battery protect unit, and those BP 220 units. It's like a 220 amp unit, and I think its highest set point is like 12 volts or something, right? So probably a 12 volt set point is absolutely fine if you're running like a 1,000 watt, 1,500 watt inverter. I would think that would be okay, especially since I bottom balanced. So honestly, that's probably the set point that I'm gonna run. We'll see how that works out. Maybe that'll be another video. This is Jesse with Create This. Hope you found this video interesting or useful. If you did, go ahead and hit the like button down below in the lower right. If you hated it, hit the dislike button. If you're curious about any of these products, I have a lot of them listed in the description of the video, so check out those links. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and ask them down below the video. I usually respond pretty quickly. As always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.